Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Danielle Carabino, and I'm the curator of painting and sculpture at the Smith College Museum of Art. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce the guest speaker, Professor Anne Lafont, who will provide the 16th Annual Miller Lecture. The Miller Lecture in Art and Art History is an endowed program established in memory of Dulcie Bloom Miller, class of 1946, that annually brings a leading artist or art historian to campus to give a public lecture and to take part in class sessions. We are grateful to the members of the Miller family who continue to support this program. Professor Lafont's visit is co-sponsored by the Smith College Lecture Committee and the French Studies Department. In addition to her lecture tonight, Professor Lafont will be meeting with French Studies students and faculty tomorrow and leading a seminar for the 5 college French faculty on colonial art in the age of slavery. Professor Lafont is the Director of Studies at the École des Hautes Études, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, and Associate Professor of Art History at the University of East Paris, Marne-la-Vallée. In 2007, she joined the French National Institute of Art History, INA, where she conducted research on gender studies and the intersection between art and science before taking up her post as editor-in-chief of the INA journal, Perspective. Her research on early modern art and visual culture focuses on the African diaspora in the 18th century imperial context and contemporary artistic theory regarding Blackness and Creolization. She's been the recipient of many grants and awards. Among her publications are numerous articles, a monograph on painter Giraudet, and an edited volume titled, in translation, Pens and Paintbrushes, Women's Lectures on Art in Europe, 1750 to 1850. She recently completed a book titled Art and Race in the Age of Enlightenment, which will be published in January 2019. Her lecture this evening relates to our current exhibition, Becoming a Woman in the Age of Enlightenment, French art from the Horvitz Collection, on view until January 6th. I cannot think of a more qualified scholar to offer an expanded vision of the 18th century French art that is sure to enhance and expand our understanding of the exhibition and beyond. The title of Professor Lafont's lecture this evening is Family Matters, Art, Race, and the Black Atlantic from Madame Benoist's Portrait d'une femme noire, 1800. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anne Lafont.
Okay. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I cannot see you behind the screen, but it was very nice to introduce me like that. So, and thank you for the invitation in general. And I want to thank Taiga Emerson, with whom I've been in touch all along for the 6 last months, and the whole staff of the Smith College Museum of Art and the French department. For the invitation, and it is a true honor to give a lecture in regard of the exhibition of 2 dear and estimated colleagues and friends, Melissa Hyde and the late Mary Sheriff. I have been working with them for more than 10 years now, and the exhibition, among many of their accomplishments, is a genuine one. So much is told about the complexity of the art of the French Enlightenment in this exhibition, besides the fact that it raises opportunely the question of the so-called woman question. Anyway, tonight I will talk about a painting that does not belong to the Horvitz Collection, but to the Musée du Louvre. And even if it's not exhibited, it was included in the wonderful fictional essay of Melissa Hyde, in which she gives voice to an imagined author, Adèle Pastel, who recalls as Olympe de Gouges, Marquis de Condorcet, or Mary Wollstonecraft, how the status and condition of women were comparable to the one of the slaves in some of the thinking of the Enlightenment's philosophy and revolutionary politics. Adèle Pastel open the gate to my contribution tonight, and I will try to connect the topics addressed by the portrait of a... Wait, I have to remember how I do. Here it is, I think. Thank you, Taiga. We have been rehearsing that many times, but I was not sure. To connect the topics addressed by the portrait of a young black woman by Madame Benoist, that you can see here, to the paintings exhibited in the museum, in the Smith College Museum of Art. Formerly called The Portrait of a Negresse, painted in 1800 by Marie-Guillemine Laville-Leroux, the wife of Mr. Benoist, this painting is particularly interesting regarding the exhibition Becoming a Woman, as it is a portrait of a woman by another woman and a portrait of a black woman by a white one. In this respect, the scholar is urged to engage with the history of early modern art, renewed by global questions, and especially by history of diasporic Africa at the time of the Atlantic slave trade. For a long time, I had intended to devote as yet unwritten monographic study in French to this painting, because while Anglo-Saxon and German-speaking colleagues had already dedicated substantial and for the most part very interesting work to it, I had the intuition that a search through the French archives would provide new information that would further extend our knowledge of this unique artwork. Until then, scholars were mainly focusing on Madame Benoist's artistic intention within the framework of the movement of the first abolition of slavery and the Parisian reception of the painting, particularly through the study of salon critiques, since the artist exhibited it in the Louvre in 1800. The Parisian exhibition had elicited commentaries in contemporary brochures and journals, which had rightly been the foundation for the historiography of the portrait. It was, nevertheless, possible to add another stone to the critical construction of the artwork, a colonial stone, which is what I want to do tonight. Therefore, I propose to study the effects of the reconfiguration and enlargement of the portrait and of the portrait's environment upon its interpretation. From the geographical point of view, this amounted to moving from Paris to the Black Atlantic, and historically from 1800 to the long 19th century. Furthermore, it is necessary to change the scale by reintroducing the painting into a larger graphic and pictorial world to which it had not yet been compared. It also involved, in my view, conceptualizing the question on a more general level by testing, in the context of this example, the possibility of an inscription of the African experience in the artistic and aesthetic field of Western visual arts. In other words, I intend to demonstrate that the models are involved in the creation of their image. Also, by reformulating the scattered corpora and paying attention to the variety of forms assumed by portraits of black women within the entire Atlantic perimeter, I constitute an ensemble providing a source and a resource for understanding African life in the colony before and after slavery. Thus, this stylistic production is to be understood not only as a stylistic ensemble marked by the colonial point of view, but also as a manifestation of Africanness within the system of slavery and subsequently post-slavery. Starting from the presumed milieu of this colonial African woman, I added a dimension to the life of the object, in this case, the painting, which until then had a limited local scope, easily accessible, since the portrait had never left metropolitan France. Most likely, the painting was conceived in the family's castle of La Motte, near Angers, western part of France, where the Benoist families, including the Benoist-Cavé couple, found themselves in the summer of 1798, a short time after they had landed in Rochefort on a boat from Guadeloupe, with their two servants, Ringa and Madeleine. Another possibility is that Madame Benoist painted the portrait in Paris either in 1798 or in 1799 during the stay of the Benoist-Cavé family and their Guadeloupean maid. Clearly, the artist had benefited from sufficient time with the model posing in order for her portrait to succeed to this degree. The paintings then remained in Madame Benoist's possession until 1818, when the Louvre proposed acquiring it with 3 other paintings by Madame Benoist, The Fortune Teller, The Witch, and The Bible Reading. This royal acquisition was undertaken thanks to the public and critical success of Madame Benoist's paintings, which were regularly exhibited at the Paris Salon, and the many commissions received by the artist during the Consulate and the First Empire. However, the royal purchase could also have been motivated by the need to compensate the artist for the sacrifice that she had made when she abandoned her career in order not to hamper her husband's professional rise in Restoration France. Marie-Juliette Ballot was a French biographer of Madame Benoist in the beginning of the 20th century, published a heartbreaking letter dated October 1st, 1814, in which Madame Benoist exposes her suffering caused by her husband's, promoted by the Restoration to the Ministry of the Interior, request to withdraw from public life and interrupt her own artistic career in order not to hinder the advancement of his career. And this kind of situation was widespread, and as noted by Melissa Hyde in the exhibition when she underlined that Anna Gaud de Saint-Germain, the author of this pastel portrait, continued to work even after her marriage, which is not the case of most of women artists at that time. In any case, without denying the impact of the portrait of a young black woman on 19th century artistic life in Paris and the frequency with which it was exhibited since 1818, it nevertheless seems desirable to add this well-known history of his topographic movements from the artist's studio to the Palais du Louvre, through the annual public exhibition in the Palais du Louvre Salon Carré, to the permanent hanging of the painting in the Louvre Museum, an additional iconographic fortune and as yet non-existent historiography based on the colonial history of France and involving the circulation of objects as well as pictorial motifs on the imperial scale. This attention to the notion of mobility allows for a reinterpretation of the painting because, generally speaking, the work of art is a blend of individual or collective projections confronting social worlds laid out in imperialistic frameworks. It is therefore important to consider this dimension through the work's documentation and interpretation. However, paintings and other works of art offered to the spectator's gaze in museums do not lend themselves to such a reading. We could even say that the more the process of aestheticization is advanced, and the Louvre Museum is a powerful agent of this decontextualization, the more the inscription of the work of art in the flow of history and in the movement of forms disappears from our interpretation of the object. I therefore propose to offer a decentered reading of the portrait of the young black woman, Madeleine, which is the name we could find in the archives, by Madame Benoist, founded on the remarkable scholarships that the portrait has inspired since its rediscovery some 20 years ago, and also by exploring anew the archives related to its creation, and above all, by confronting the painting with the Atlantic history of the Black diaspora. Madeleine was portrayed by Madame Benoist sometime between 1798 and 1800, between Anjou and Paris, though it is not possible to be more precise about the posing and painting sessions. The young black woman was a servant of the Benoist-Cavé couple, in which the husband, Auguste, had been an administrator in Guadeloupe since 1789, and more generally an official in the Navy Ministry. After a 2-year stay in France, 1790 to 1800, he left for Guyana, where he lived for a few years during the first decade of the 19th century. The young painter, Marie Guillemine, and her sister, Marie-Elisabeth Laville-Leroux, had both studied in the studio of Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun and later, in the late 80s, with Jacques-Louis David. However, the institutional moral code had prevented David's female students from having access to the Little Louvre workshop that the master had reserved for them on the pretext that they might encounter young men. And I just remembered by visiting the exhibition yesterday that Margaret Oppenheimer was the author of an exhibition in this very same museum in 2005 entitled The French Portrait, Revolution to Restoration, and she had done an amazing research of reattribution of paintings given to David that were actually realized by her women pupils. And among her discoveries, there was this portrait of Madame de Richemont, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and who was attributed to David until she did reattribute it convincingly to Madame Benoist, which is also the author of the Portrait de Jeune Femme Noire, or Portrait of Madeleine, we can say now. Anyway, Madame Benoist was trained by two great artists, so Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun and David, who lead the most prestigious painting school of the period. Two artists politically on opposing poles, since Vigée-Lebrun was a royalist while David was a Jacobin, but who never saw their talents questioned on the basis of the vagaries of their respective political convictions. For their part, Marie-Guillemine Leroux-Laville and her husband, Pierre-Vincent Benoist, they were married in March of 1793, were loyal to the king, and Monsieur Benoist even had to spend 18 months in hiding during the terror of the Revolution. At the time, both worked to survive, which, according to some scholars, explains some of Marie-Guillemine's interest in the fate of Madeleine, a black servant of a French colonial family. The Benoist couple, for example, translated and illustrated a number of contemporary English books, including the Scottish explorer Mungo Park's travels into the interior of Africa, and among them are also a few works by women writers who set out to provide an outlet for women's experience in the arts, including the memoirs of Mrs. Bellamy, a Covent Garden actress. The couple moved to a dwelling in the Louvre in 1796, like some other fellow artists, and Madame Benoist started painting the portrait of Madeleine, inspired by the model developed by David at that time in his portraits of Madame Trudel, the one you can see here, or Madame Danton. The portrait of this young black woman also echoed the portrait of Jean-Baptiste Bellay by Giraudet, a friend of the Benoist sisters and another student of David from the late 80s. The portrait of the first black deputy to the convention, the name of the National Assembly during the terror, a former slave, free person of color, elected to represent the island of Santo Domingo, a French Caribbean colony on the point of becoming independent in 1804, under the name of Haiti, was conceived in 1796. At the time, as piecing together the artist's social contacts would suggest, Giraudet was close to the Société des Amis des Noirs, which promulgated both the abolition of the slave trade and progressively of slavery itself. Giraudet had therefore imagined a work that made this political figure, this elected black deputy of the French Republic, the symbol of the revolution's accomplishment in terms of citizenship. Giraudet's Bellay embodied a revolutionary, egalitarian, and progressive political ideal most likely dear to Bellay, since his arrival at the Convention was crowned by the vote on the first abolition of slavery on February 4, 1794. It is in the context of political emancipation following the terror that the painter and the model created this image of the Republic's black hero, wearing the costume of the elected representative and leaning against the bust of the author of the philosophical and political history of the settlements and trade of the Europeans in the East and West Indies. Indeed, Raynal, an emblematic figure of the Enlightenment philosophy, inscribed Bellay's public accomplishment within a French genealogy that confirms the Revolution as a daughter of the Enlightenment and the former slave Bellay as a citizen, emancipated supposedly thanks to French magnanimity and reason. While it appears obvious that Madame Benoist was aware of Girodet's painting and its critical reception, did the desire to emulate such a colorist challenge encourage her to undertake the portrait of her brother-in-law's servant? In any case, it is also clear that her political motivations, known from Benoist couple's correspondence, were exactly on the opposite side of those promoted in the portrait of Bellay. The Benoist couple belonged to the clan supporting a prosperous slave colony and were convinced that the obstacles to the slave trade progressively introduced by European legislation was a drawback which the fate of African slaves in no way mitigated. Consequently, were these two portraits complementary? They were indeed painted 3 years apart by artists who were neighbors, friends, and studio colleagues. But unless we pair them only stylistically, we have to bear in mind that their respective political intentions are diametrically opposed. As a result, this again proves that we need to uncouple the notions of style and ideology. Though there is obviously a common stylistic, generational, and workshop footprint, the two artists belong to political families with opposing views about slavery and colonialism. And even more deeply, Girodet had joined to the Régicide Revolution, while Madame Benoist, with her father and husband, had supported the royal family to the very end. From these opposing national political choices, there emerged equally divergent positions on freedom and citizenship, found at the core of debates about the status of slaves. Whatever the case, and despite these necessary precisions, my project aims to understand the portrait beyond the Parisian politico-artistic context of the Revolution and the Consulate, and to follow the painting's plural trajectories, contrasting it to a series of images and objects found outside the traditional stylistic filiations that extends from Raphael's Fornarina to Gross's Republic. Grounding my analysis in the Atlantic origin of the work, I want to bring out another interpretation of the painting. A topographical displacement that inserts the painting into the model's milieu offers a theoretical displacement conducive to its rereading. I will therefore proceed in three stages that rethink the black female body into the imperial context. 1, the erotic body; 2, the nurturing body; and 3, the dressed body. I will then re-examine the notion of periphery, basing the shift of my interpretation on a new chronology of portraits of black women in the French colonial empire of the late 18th century. Madeleine's bare chest led initially to an erotic trail in the scholarship, conditioned by the famous Renaissance, Raphael, which I just showed you, Renaissance precedent, before taking a political turn and giving pride of place to the classicizing figure created by David's pupil, Gros, which is this one. So these two possibilities need by no means to be excluded. It is even more interesting to Africanize this partial nudity by recalling to what extent the representation of this breast is part of the widespread practices of women's use of their bodies in the French Empire. The trading of bodies and persons in the context of the commerce with the colonists and within the more or less tolerated practice of interracial sexual relations, both in the African trading outposts and in the societies of Caribbean and continental French colonies, was an Atlantic issue that Benoist's painting summarizes. And I show this Signard posing in a dress by Aimé de Lesseps, which is at the Musée de Fort-de-France and painted in 1830. Indeed, the figure of the Senegalese Signard and Creole Placé are implicitly evoked by the painting inasmuch as, on both sides of the Atlantic, both belong to intermediary, feminine, autonomous, rich and powerful social and racial categories. They know how to take advantage of these forms of marriage contracts, which are distinct from sexual slavery and rape perpetrated on the plantations. The Signares were mixed-race women who had settled on the island of Saint Louis and on the Senegalese coast since the 17th century. They were born to mixed European-African couples and were at the origin of communities that combined Wolof and European customs. Portuguese and Jewish sailors and merchants fleeing mandatory Catholic conversion on the Iberian Peninsula were the first to contract these Luso-African unions. In 1658, with the founding of the town of Saint Louis as a French trading post, French people started to get involved in this kind of unions. An Afro-European commercial network was thus granted by these formidable tradeswomen. The Signares, at the helm of trading communities and powerful social classes, pursued their activities over several centuries, continuing to favor métissage as an erotic device and a commercial pawn, playing out in their homes the sensual excess based on luxury and abundance in order to attract the best matches. These marriages were contracted with the obvious aim of material benefits. The extant iconography of the Signares from the mid-19th century on the eve of their disappearance, shows these intergenerational communities of women whose bodies are covered corresponding to their social rank. The accumulation of fabrics appears to indicate the model's high status, while conversely, the uncovering of the breast reveals her status as a slave, because they had slaves in their homes. Headdresses, fabrics, colors, and female bodies all offer an image of these African women's houses, in contrast to metropolitan brothels and oriental harems, as active communities whose erotic aspect was far from being its main purpose, as Aissate Canelo, the scholar, explains very clearly. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the American colonies under Catholic and French rule, similar figures emerge. Thus, Benoist's Guadeloupean has to be compared to Louisiana's Creole placé, or more generally with black servants whose relations with their masters were transformed through intimacy and involved long-term cohabitation or the formation for the white colonist of a second illegitimate and more or less hidden and often urban family, as with the Signares in Saint Louis. Most of the time, these unions were concluded by the enfranchisement of the enslaved wife and the children, who furthermore benefited from a part of the inheritance from the white father. The variety of cohabitation and marital unions that existed in different African countries from which merchants acquired their slaves suggests that different kinds of interracial marriages were being reinvented in different ways on both sides of the Atlantic. The normative codification of marriages between whites and people of color also varied both in time and in different French colonies of the Americas, as we can understand it from the more or less legal practices that were adopted by the settlers. For example, the Code Noire, Black Code, French law regarding life in the colonial plantations, did not regulate cohabitation, since the shortage of what women had in practice encouraged settlers to place African or Creole housekeepers, ménagères, which are the placés, in their home. This type of union, which had been found on the African coast for several centuries, appeared in the colonies, mainly in Santo Domingo and Louisiana, locations of the largest enslaved communities under the French regime in the 18th century. Madeleine's chest, as painted by Benoist, now appears more significant than I had first imagined, because in the African and diasporic tradition of female entrepreneurship, where the body is indeed the instrument of emancipation and social ascension, and has nothing to do with the systematic rape characteristic of slavery's absolute violence, the visibility of one of the model's breasts signifies initiative, action, and a form of freedom and autonomy for a Black woman within a system of domination. Likewise, the image of another contemporary Black woman, Johanna, slave and concubine of John Gabriel Stedman, a settler in Dutch Guyana and author of the famous Voyage to Suriname, with whom, Johanna, he had a son who he educated in Europe after the mother's death, is also revealing. William Blake and his French engraver Tardieu also represented Johanna's bare chest as an archetypal figure of interracial relationships in the colonial world of slavery. Though we do not know the nature of the relationship between Madeleine and Benoist Cavé, I will go back to this image. We do know the interracial relations between masters and slaves, but also between whites and free people of color were widespread, as suggested in particular in Jean-Baptiste Dutertre and Jean-Baptiste Labasse travel narratives, who regularly complain about this colonial depravity in their books. From this point of view, the lives of some famous figures from the 18th century and 19th century are equally eloquent. The life, for example, the Guadeloupean Chevalier Joseph Bologne de Saint-Georges, military man, brilliant violinist, composer, and a sportsman renowned throughout Europe, was born to an enslaved mother and a colonial white father. Or Thomas Alexandre David de la Pailletterie, also known as Général Dumas, hero of the Napoleonic Wars, who was born in Santo Domingo to a white noble colonist father and a black enslaved mother, Marie Cécette Dumas. He was the father and grandfather of the famous novelists Alexandre Dumas, father and son. Thus, reference to the Amazon as a model is now superfluous, because we had a time in the historiography where the bare chest of Madeleine, which was not known as Madeleine at this time, would have been borrowed from the Amazon model. And I think this reference is now superfluous. An ancient mythological figure that inspires a representation of a conquering breast may indeed have played a role in Madame Benoist's culture, as probably did, by the way, the Jeanne Hachette that you can see in the exhibition à Beauvais by Le Barbier in 1784. It is a drawing for the painting, or the Cleopatra by Antoine Rivas that you can see as well in the exhibition in the museum. And even more probably the Aspasie as autoportrait of Marie-Geneviève Bouliard in 1794 that you can see here, which is not exhibited in the museum, but was also evoked by Melissa Hyde in the cartel in the museum. So all these figures could belong to the culture of Madame Benoist, but I thought maybe with what I have been showing about the Signard and also the Placé, we could think of the fact that not only the classical cultural model of the strong woman was active in the making of the model, and maybe the sitter did herself bring to the front her own culture of strong woman in the making of the painting. Yet the fact that the controls of one's own body as a female tool of world conquest seems to have been operative since the 17th century in Senegal, and was in turn exported throughout the Black Atlantic, leads us to assume that the figure of the Signard could lend itself as an incarnation of the strong woman, and thus, if not save the artist from the detour into antiquities models, at least allowed her black sitter, Madeleine, to perform an empowered woman as a suggestion to her portraying. In this perspective, the bare breast is a reflection of Madeleine's empowerment despite the asymmetrical relationship between the model and her painter, as well as that of the servant in relation to her master and employee, in this case, the artist's brother-in-law, Benoist Cavé. Madeleine's haughty and noble pose suggests a free and autonomous personality, as does another detail of the painting. The artist's signature, delicately calligraphed in the lower right of the painting, just above the model's right hand, as you can see, I hope, from the image here. Contemporary commentators were sensitive to this play of hands and authorities, and remarked both on the rustic and diabolical aspect of the hook, I quote, of course, that served as a hand to the young black woman. Moreover, they noted that it was very surprising that a beautiful white hand, that of the artist, could be wasted in representing such an ugly subject, a black woman. And I did insert the quote here of the critic. This symbolic intertwining of hands led to simplistic and racist interpretations, whereas it seems to me that the motif itself encourages another understanding of the work, yet again independent of the artist's intention. Indeed, this apparently formal shortcut, which advances the motif of the hands in relation to the authority of the painting, and the issue of the black subject, encourages us to look among the practices of manumission and marriage, two legal acts that affect the status of persons and whose power rests in the gesture itself. The placing of the hands on the enslaved body in order to liberate it, and the signature on the marriage contract are legal acts. The painting shows a juxtaposition of the family name Benoist and the body of the model, since the signature reads Laville Leroux, femme, that is, wife of Benoist, which evokes marriage, apparently that of the Benoist couple in March 1793. And we have also a wonderful example of this kind of signature in the exhibition in the Motherhood and Artistic Creation section. It is the one by Madame Rollin, born Giroux, and you can see the signature in the lower left here. Getting back to Madame Benoist's painting, we see that on a metaphorical level, the marriage evocation by the signature can lead as well to interracial unions that often permitted a liberation through manumission, either in a will or, more often in the Anglo-Saxon world, by a particular gesture dating from antiquity, where the master put both hands on the body of the slave in the presence of witnesses, allowing him to or her to obtain freedom. Thus, the signature of the artist as Benoist's wife, placed precisely above the hand of the young black woman, could again be read through the set of metropolitan and colonial social practices which contribute to the interpretative surface of the painting. To bestow one's name in marriage and or to put one's hands on a body, these two legal acts transformed private feelings, love, affection, gratitude, into legal acts entailing major public consequences regarding the status of an individual, and in this case, women, wives, concubines, and or black servants. The work of the Argentine psychoanalyst Rita Laura Segato on black wet nurses in the Americas and the construction of Brazilian society around the negation of this ancient and lasting social reality before and after slavery, together with the book by artist and art historian Marcus Wood, eloquently entitled Black Milk, I invite us to follow another thread in this painting, a colonial thread that allows us to add a nurturing dimension to this bare breast, in addition to the erotic marital aspects. It is interesting to note that it was a painting that led the psychoanalyst Segato to study the psychic motif of the black wet nurse in the Brazilian imagination. A discovery of a painting exhibited without a label at the Imperial Palace of Petropolis near Rio revealed an obvious fact to her, namely that black wet nurses in almost every layer of Brazilian society since the early days of colonization have not been conceptualized in national history. Segato wanted to document the painting, exhibited without its author's name and without identification of the models. She discovered an initial attribution to the artist Jean-Baptiste Debré, a member of the French expedition to Brazil in 1816, and identified the sitters as the imperial person of Don Pedro and his wet nurse. Nevertheless, scholars and the museum have rejected this attribution. The psychoanalyst interpreted this rejection as a denial of that black milk that nourished Brazil for 4 centuries in order to whitewash the most august origin of the country. This pictorial anecdote, and whatever the truth is, it's more than that, of course. This pictorial anecdote, which gave birth to Segato's superb study of Brazilian black wet nurses, resonates with the national icon, the famous Portrait of a Black Woman by Tarsila do Amaral in 1923. Not that it is necessary to corroborate this fundamental nurturing activity of African slaves, later house servants, and other black women in Brazil. However, Madeleine herself was not a nanny in the Benoist Cave. Tant pis, je vais rester là. However, Madeleine herself was not a nanny in the Benoist Cave household because, according to the family tree, the couple that included Catherine Vidal and Auguste Benoist Cave had no offspring, at least not legitimate ones. Furthermore, there is another argument for involving this painting with the question of wet nurses. It is also related to fundamental issues of the construction of race in a colonial situation, that is to say, involving proximity of different racial communities, which, despite the asymmetry and violence in colonial relations, cohabited closely in the plantations, undeterred by the fact that legislation tended to forbid sexual relations between masters and slaves. The obsession with transmitting the stain is the obsession with darkness that from the 18th century onwards manifests itself in the control of fluids, the purity of blood being endangered by reproduction between people of different races via sperm. This obsession seems not to have entered European mentalities around the question of mother's milk, which appears to be the only naturally produced human fluid whose insidious contamination colonial society did not fear. This potential anxiety was most likely rationalized by observation. Milk is white regardless of the skin color of the nurse, and children fed on it did not change from one race to another. To my knowledge, only one artist emphasized the black anxiety over these transitory adoptions. Lucilio de Albuquerque, also a Brazilian artist who painted the confrontation implied in these double allegations faced by the wet nurse. The white adopted son is in direct competition with her own offspring, the black child neglected by her side. This practice was also widespread in the slave-owning South of the United States, as seen in this engraving from 1861. Thus, breastfeeding, in the context of the exchange of fluids between people from white and black communities, in other words, in the inevitable human promiscuity of colonial dwellings, was the only one openly authorized and even shown and exhibited, if we credit the high number of paintings, prints, and photographs of this motif. We can read transracial breastfeeding as the only sensual outlet allowed between whites and blacks whose relations were moreover restricted through normative interdictions and obsessive segregations, though these were not very effective within the French Empire and thus were even more restricted in legislation since they were so little respected in practice. The last aspect of this painting, to go back, and I don't have it now, but to remember it, I should have put it back in the slide show. The last aspect of this painting of Madame Benoist and of Madeleine that I would like to note is not so much the partially bare body as much as a garment, or rather I have to find it because you need to see. because the rhetoric of fabrics and clothing in the American colonies was just as symbolic as that of the naked body, with which it naturally stood cheek by jowl. It has not escaped commentators' attention that the three Republican colors, red, white, and blue, appear on Madeleine's clothing. A white scarf covers her head while her bust is draped in the same cotton or silk fabric, a muslin probably. The trim glows slightly in contrast to the more matte character of the fabric at the wall. A magnificent blue shawl, perhaps slightly velvety, it seems simultaneously thick, opaque, and silky, covers the back of the green armchair, while a discreet red ribbon girdles the model's high waist and crumples the white negligee below the breasts. While the French Republic intervenes in the painting and protects this young black woman, like Belle, who wore a deputy's uniform designed by David in 1794 for the convention, the color symbolism also carries an Atlantic dimension. The currency of exchange in the context of transatlantic trade between England, the Netherlands, and France on the one side and various African trading posts on the other was at the time the Guinea, from the name of the West African territory where many transactions took place. Guinea referred to ordinary cotton cloth dyed dark blue, similar to the fabric laid carelessly on the armchair. On the other hand, various Indian white cotton fabrics were used by women of color in the colonies, as revealed in the works by Agostino Brunias and French Martinique painter Le Mazirier that you can see on the right. Pictorial chroniclers of Caribbean life in the last third of the 18th century, whose paintings show a preponderance of white clothing. Madeleine was another example, was another example of a woman who imported her traditional costume to Paris, including the beautiful scarf wrapped around her head and hair, which also echoes the Phrygian bonnet or the Oriental turban found in the iconography of blacks in Orientalist painting, at the one of Rigaud, of the portrait of a black young boy in the beginning of the 18th century. However, I think that Madame Benoist clearly painted an African woman from the West Indies in a Parisian chair. The coloring of the Republican cockade is added to Afro-Caribbean clothing traditions that existed well before the French Revolution. Finally, in order to complete this attempt to migrate from the artist's intention to the model's life, from the Paris salon to the world of the colonial plantation, and from the black body object to the black subject, I would like to resituate provincial and colonial peripheries to the center of art historical chronology. This movement reinserts the painting into a more global and less heroic national narrative than the one that turned this masterpiece into the cornerstone of the modern image of the black woman. Indeed, its antecedent from Quebec, François Malépart de Beaucourt's painting from 1786, that you can see on the right, transforms his story and turns the Parisian canvas into an avatar. The model representation of the Creole, a black woman from the colonies in control of her body, had already been invented by this Canadian and colonial painter some 15 years before the Parisian work. Malépart de Beaucourt left Montreal in the early 70s and settled in Bordeaux, where after about a decade in 1784, he was admitted to the city's Academy of Painting. He then left for Santo Domingo, where he spent several years during which he painted this portrait of a black woman who is still alive. In the early 90s, he returned to the American continent, more precisely to Philadelphia, where he advertised in a local newspaper offering his services as a portraitist and drawing instructor. Though Beaucourt died in Montreal in 1794, a year after returning to his homeland, he had time to conceive the first version of the modern black female icon. Admittedly, the portrait of this young woman from Santo Domingo lacks the stylistic quality of the Louvre painting, but the madras scarf, the bare breast leaning toward the ball with the pineapple in an amalgam that is both appealing and erotic, and the white garment contrasting with the dark skin of the model were new motifs that the artist borrowed both from colonial life and a conquering feminine universe. The growing artistic reputation of the painting in our time, of the painting of Madeleine, which deserves a book in itself, is confirmed, among other things, by the fact that Madeleine was featured by Beyoncé and Jay-Z in their latest video film in the Louvre, after having been appropriated by many other contemporary artists, thus feeding into a long-term history of bodily performance in the conquest that points toward the emancipation of African and diasporic women. Madeleine, African and Caribbean, enslaved and emancipated, servant and concubine, black and French, modern and subject, has resided in the Louvre for more than 2 centuries and could, as such, recast a trajectory in the museum, conscious of this ancient but still unwritten presence. To be continued. Thank you. I'm not sure, but
yes. So now we invite you to stay for any questions that you may have. And if you do, if you would just raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone. Thank you.
yeah, sorry. Pardon.
Thank you very much. So I would like, my name is Esther Schinger, and I'm an art history and French student here at Smith. Okay. And I would love to ask you personally, what is your view about the fact that there is very little representation of people of color in various paintings shown in museums, public museums that all people can access? And what do you think they should do to include people of color in these things?
I hope I heard you well. I'm not sure I heard you so well, but I think you are wondering why there is so little documentation about the paintings with people of color in the museum. Is that it?
Yeah, basically that's all.
Physically, why there are so little paintings with people of color in the museum? Is that your question? Why?
What do you think they should do
to adjust?
To adjust that?
I think what I've been experiencing, I've been working about, I would say, the image of the black in Western art for about 15 years now. And actually, I think there are many motifs or figures of people of color in the arts in general, much more than we could think of maybe 20 years ago. And for example, I could say that this initiative of Harvard, but was at the beginning by the Menil couple about the image of the black series and publication. And at the beginning, the Menil couple launched this initiative, and they thought it would take about 1 year or 2 years to have to gather the documentation about the image of the black in Western art. And after 30 years, we are still working on it. That's because it's much bigger than we thought of at the beginning. So I think maybe what is lacking in the museum and in the history in general is the attention paid to this motif. But for example, when I began to work on this topic, all my friends, each time they could find one black figure everywhere, they did send it to me. So, and they became conscious that there were so many more than they thought in the beginning. So I think the paying attention and trying to document also all the paintings or the artworks we have will give back finally the place occupied by these figures and eventually by the people of color and how they contributed to the life of France or I don't know, anywhere in the world. So I think it's a question of attention and to give time to document and to try to find. For example, it was very easy in the end to find the name of the sitter here. And for 200 years, the painting has been exhibited in the Louvre and nobody has been searching for the name of the sitter. And I knew I would find something, I was not sure. And in 2 months, I just began the work and found that her name was Madeleine very easily. So I think we have to shift the objects of our researches more than to create new objects that did not exist. They were there. I think so.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it. So my question is kind of about the way that you've had your presentation. I'm doing research that kind of deals a lot with presenting bare bodies. I'm kind of doing research on blackface in the United States and black women's depiction in that. And so I'm interested in your decision to present these women who are kind of unclothed, and if that was ever uncomfortable for you or how you dealt with it.
Once again, I'm not so fluent in English, and you are wondering how I deal with the fact that I show so many women bare. We just had in France very polemical controversy around the publication of a book which is called Sex, Race et Colonies. I think I don't have to translate, it's almost the same words in English. And it's a very big book and coffee table book in a way, which shows all the images possible that showed rape and violence, sexual violence against women of color in all parts of the French Empire. And it was many scholars and also the audiences, more large audiences, got angry with the fact that it was so easily published and given to see without cautious advertisement. What I'm doing, I'm trying not to be so. I want to address the visual question and the visual dimension of what I'm talking about. I don't want in no way to talk about something and not to show it. So, but what I'm trying to do is always to select the images or the paintings I'm addressing, and I will never do an overview of all the monstrosities that have been happening during the time, but just to focus, for example, on one specific portrait and try to develop from that. And before I'm launching the slideshow, I'm trying to talk a lot about what I'm going to show. And that's, how would I say it? That's the way I find to adjust between the fact that it's, in a way, difficult, and especially, I would say, for me, because I'm always close to the painting and showing myself so close to the painting itself. But I think when you are not dealing with the quantity of images and you have a discourse that is before the slideshow, I would say, it helps to go together in confronting it. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but it would I wouldn't be on my ease to talk about it without showing it. Or what was also a proposition from some women who were affected by the book in question by Pascal Blanchard, I have to tell his name, is that because there were many photographies, which is something else. I'm not dealing with photographies. Probably I would have to find another way to do that. But they would have liked that he had blurred the eyes or the faces so that we cannot recognize. But I think it would be worse, because we have to know that there are human beings behind this kind of violent scenes. And what is, for me, difficult is when people just have so many slides to show, and they have to emphasize the visual effect. And I think I don't do that because I go slow. I hope so. I don't do that because I go slowly, and the discourse is as much important as the showing of the images. But you will tell me if it was.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the reception of your work in France, and how, in my experience, France has been very slow to sort of think about its colonial histories and questions of race. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how your work has been received, and how the field has changed or not changed in the last 15 years, or in the time that you've been shaping it.
And I'm thinking of the video there and where it will go, and so no, I'm thinking of it. But what I must say, it's really changing a lot. I think for the last maybe 3-4 years, and even each year it's changing a lot. I must say that I did not work in this field. Well, I have been hired as an art historian, a very traditional art historian, and I wrote my dissertation about Giraudet. And I did get all my jobs until the last one, last year, when I was hired by EHESS. Basing on something very different from the question of race, of art history and race, of representation and visual worlds and race. So, and I think, and I'm absolutely sure, I wouldn't have had a job 20 years ago, for example, if I had proposed a topic like that. And especially because art history is one of the most conservative disciplines in the social or in the humanities in France. So maybe it's a little bit different because the colonial history in France has existed for a long time. Maybe it's not addressed the same way like in the US, but you have for a long time African studies and also, yes, African studies, broad Africa, African, sub-Saharan Africa, and also North Africa studies for a long time in France in the history, but it did not exist in art history. And I must say that I used to study in Canada, and it was also difficult when I was young. It was in the 1990s. It was also difficult to have a topic. I wanted to work on the African American artists at that time, and I couldn't find really people supporting my work because it was a modernist paradigm was also so important. So both sides of the Atlantic at this time, it was not so easy to work, at least in the Francophone universities or academic world, about this kind of topics. And I don't know why. We were wondering yesterday with Taiga, why did it change in the last years in France? Probably because the younger people, younger than me, who are the first or the second generation of immigration, because it's not the same history than in the US. It's something more connected to the post-colonial and post-independence of the colonies of France. We are, and these are the younger people than I am. They are now in the universities, in the public space, and they ask for a history more connected to their lives and to their own private histories or private stories as well. So it must push the academic sphere to answer this kind of questions, I guess, because, and not only the ones, I think it's generational. It's not only the ones, the black students or the Arab students. It's more mixed people, but it's a generation who wants to address the question, of colonial history, of race problems or race issues also in France, which was something not really conscious of. France was not really conscious of until, I would say, 5 or 6 years in the art historical field, at least, I would say. But I have supporters, and because you were wondering how is the reception of my work, I have people who do not like what I do, which is normal. But I really have, I think, also an expectation for this field to be more important. I think also in France. Thank you.